Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. Please remember to like, share, and leave a comment. I promise to read all of them, and it really does help me a lot. Now, let's get to the stories. It's hard to explain to someone who has never done it what it's like to look through the scope of a gun at an animal. It's kind of like what I imagine a horse feels like when it has blinders on, or what people mean when they say they have tunnel vision. It's hard to explain, but it feels like the rest of the world disappears. When you say, it's just you and the animal, everything you see through the scope becomes your whole world. It seems like everything is framed. Everything shrunk down to a small scene. The world is still there, of course. The smell of the forest and the animal. The small, quiet noises it makes as it moves, and the noises you make when you try to hold your breath and be as quiet as possible. But there's a moment when everything, and all of your senses, seem to be focused on that one image through the scope. I wish I could feel that way again, but I don't think I ever will. Not after that day. We had been in the mountains for 2 days, camping in the woods and going out each morning to look for moose in the clearer areas. I say this a lot, but you don't really understand how big those things are until you see one in the wild. I think this is because you've grown up seeing drawings of moose and books about kitty where the size is off, so you think they're about the size of a cow. They aren't. They are very big. We had been following one's tracks that day and had come out in an open area by the water. We had settled down, and I had set up my gun so I could see the river bank and the area around it clearly. When we heard the noise, I had just knelt down behind some bushes. To our left, we could hear the clear snapping of branches, which is caused by something big pushing its way through the bracken. I felt my heart beat faster, and I knelt down with a mix of excitement and fear. I turned the gun's barrel so that it pointed in that direction. When I looked through the scope to see where the sound was coming from, I saw the biggest moose I had ever seen. Even by themselves, his antlers were almost as tall as a man. I watched as he rolled totally unaware into my line of sight, and then he stopped. When I looked at him, it was like I hit the pause button, because he just stood still. I put the gun's barrel against my shoulder and set my sights on him again. And then it happened, that moment when you forget about everything else for maybe a minute. We were the only ones there? Then all of a sudden, it wasn't. Suddenly, there was something else in the picture, a huge mass of hair. I thought that was another animal for a moment, maybe another moose, a deer, or even a bear. After a second, the vision became clearer and I realized what was going on. I was not looking at an animal. It was a piece of an animal, a back-bent leg with a mix of fur and what looked like rotting flesh hanging from it. It stuck out into the view. Almost the same size as the moose. I don't know why I didn't run or why I didn't take my eye off the scope and look properly. Maybe it was safer that way. I thought it might not be real as long as I looked through the scope and at the separate world, but it was. As I stood still and watched, the head of the thing, which looked more like a skull than a face, turned forward. I've never seen anything so disgusting in my life, huge things with a tangle of antlers and horns pointing up. The flesh again hung in rotting shreds, like the sails of a ship clinging to the skeleton of the mast. I'd heard people in the area talk about the wendigo, but I didn't believe them. Now I do. The next thing I knew, my friend had his hand on my shoulder and was pulling me back. I ran and ran for almost 2 miles straight. Small black square, I didn't pick up my gun, didn't go back to camp, but kept moving. We both did it, and we did it all night long, groping forward, trying to get out of the forest, out of the mountains, and away. With every step, we felt that the darkness was just behind us. Since then, I haven't gone hunting, and I never will again. There are much worse things hiding between the trees than animals. Small black square, I know because I've seen them. 2019. I remember being in first grade and listening to our teacher, who I thought was very nice, read us the book The Very Hungry Caterpillar. The story is about a caterpillar who can't get enough to eat. He keeps eating, and with each meal, he gets fatter and fatter. It was the class's favorite. It was the one book they always asked for, no matter how many times we had all heard it. All of the children loved it, but one of them didn't like it as much as the others. For me, the story of a creature with an insatiable hunger made me think of a scary story I had heard before. I was aware. The one my grandparents told me, in which, unlike in other stories, the caterpillar was said to be real. The caterpillar only ate silly foods and vegetables, but the main character in the stories my grandparents told me ate a lot more scary things. My grandparents told me that the wendigo could never be full. Because of this, its body was a skeletal, thin, and emaciated wreck, with skin, flesh, and long rotten sinews hanging off of it. The wendigo absorbed everything it ate, so it kept getting bigger and bigger, but it never felt full. The result was a never-ending hunger, a churning feeling of starvation that made this creature, which lived somewhere between life and death, always hunt. Small black square, of course, that stupid colorful children's story was nothing like the wendigo, small black square, but the tale of its hunger was too close for comfort. As I got older, I forgot where to go, just like you forget the fairy tales you heard as a child. I knew that telling folk tales was a way for my grandparents to keep their culture alive, but I also thought it was old-fashioned. I felt like they were telling me a ghost story as if it were true. I guess in some ways it's like believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, but this wendigo story they told us was different, especially because they didn't want me to believe it because it was good for me. I can now see that what they did wasn't cruel, but a warning. When my son was in elementary school, I decided to have a camping sleepover for boys one weekend before the new school year started. We drove a short distance north to a place by a lake where you can camp. We found a place near the lake and set up camp there. We were sitting by the fire, making jokes and talking about his school friends, when we heard a sound that seemed to come from above us and all around us at the same time. I slowly stood there, afraid that it could be a bear or a bull moose. I looked along the tree line but couldn't see anything. But when I looked up, I saw only bare branches reaching for the sky at first. Then, from behind the trees, I saw antlers, a set of thick, horned antlers so wide that it was impossible for them to be up there like that or for them to belong to any living animal. After just a second, my mind went back to when I was a child, and I immediately knew what was standing there. All of my grandparents' stories and warnings came back to me. Without a second's hesitation, I turned, grabbed my son, and started to run, leaving the camp and whatever else might have been hiding behind the trees. Behind me, I heard the branches cracking and snapping as something big roared through. I yelled at my son to close his eyes and not look at what was chasing us, but as we turned the corner onto the footpath, my eyes, as if pulled by an invisible magnet, turned back, and I saw it right away. The wendigo looked like a bunch of dead animals that had been stitched together and stacked bone on bone to make a new, twisted body. Its face, if you can call it that, was like the skull of a moose or deer, but it had grown and stretched to the size of an elephant or some other larger animal in the eye sockets. It was yellow in the middle, but the edges were sticky and old gray. It turned toward us as its thick, snake-like tongue hung and flickered, as if the thing we were tasting the air and getting ready to eat us. I knew at that moment what it was, what it wanted, and that it was hungry. I also knew that it would always be hungry and that to it, we looked like food. When my grandparents told me about the wendigo, I ran faster than I ever had before and didn't look back. I listen. When my grandfather told me it was my birthright and part of who I was to see the thing at least once, I didn't quite understand. I suppose that my family is lucky. My son also pays attention to the warnings I ignored, because he opened his eyes and saw that thing even though I told him not to. A friend gave him and my daughter a copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar for Christmas last year. Even back then, I cringed at the thought of something that can never be full and will always look for and eat. Even though it was a book for kids, it was too close to home. Before they could read it, I threw it away. Small black square, 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 small black square. I don't really think of myself as living off the grid, but when it comes to eating and buying meat, I only buy from local farmers and growers. About a month ago, I bought about 12 pounds of ground beef and some steaks. I bought these from a nearby farmer who lives in the area and raises and slaughters all of his own cattle. If you or anyone else who reads this gets the chance to try your own locally owned beef, I'd much rather do that than buy it from a store. It's much cleaner and leaner. Well, I'd tell you to do it, but that's not the point of my story. So I go get the meat, and it's a pretty cold night. I think it got below freezing. So, on this night, I left the meat in these 2 big paper bags in the cab of my truck. I then got out of the truck, locked it, went inside, and went to bed. So, when I woke up the next morning, I found something very strange. Over the course of the night, someone or something tried to break into my truck. The handle was literally twisted off the driver's side door, and the glass was bent in and cracked down by the tire. Where you would stand to get up and open the door, I saw the biggest dog tracks I'd ever seen. I was very confused by this discovery, and it took me a while to figure out who this possible thief might have been. I looked at the tracks and saw that they went all the way around the truck and into the grassy knoll. The fact that the tracks weren't quadrupedal like you'd expect from a dog was very disturbing. They walked in a very 2-legged way, like some kind of 2-legged dog with very big feet. I'm talking about something bigger than my 2 feet, and I wear size 13 boots. So something came from this area with the grassy knoll. They tried to break into my truck when they came up to it. Keep in mind that it was still in the 30s in the morning, which is close to freezing. That's why I left my meat in my freezer in the first place. If you're wondering why I didn't put it away, it's because my fridge wasn't fully working yet, and I had to clean it before I could put the meat away. So, to keep it cold, I left it in the truck overnight. Well, something must have smelled it, even though I had the windows up and there's no way any animal or wild animal could have smelled it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the ground, and I thought it was a bear, but there were no bears in this area. Maybe smaller black bears, but definitely not grizzlies or big brown bears, since that's the only thing that would make sense to have this kind of power. I mean, should I have taken photos? Something with a lot of force must have pulled the metal door handle off and almost broke the glass. Something was trying to get into the cabin of my truck, but I don't know why. The only thing I can think of is that it was after the meat in there.